All right. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody, to September CocoaHeads. We're about to get underway for yet another virtual meetup. So let's do this. Just a reminder, you can join in the discussion tonight on our Slack group. We've got a link to the Slack channel there on that slide. I'll also be showing it on another slide later on, if you miss it. Oops. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Sorry about that. I had another tab open with the YouTube stream, and so I could hear myself, but about 30 seconds delayed, so that's not great. Anyway, onwards. So to begin with tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which CocoaHeads normally gathers in the CBD, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. Bit of housekeeping before we begin. So, hey, I'm Zach. I'm one of the organizers of CocoaHeads. On the call tonight, we've also got Nikki. He helps me run CocoaHeads. So, hey, Nikki.
Hey, guys. Welcome tonight.
Nikki will also be giving a month in review in a few moments. And we've also got Carl, who helps us organize CocoaHeads. He's not on the call tonight, but I believe he's watching. So, hey, Carl. And as always, a big thank you to our sponsors. They cover our running costs and help make the event possible, even in this remote time. So thanks to Billu and Atlassian for that. And just a reminder that Sydney CocoaHeads has a code of conduct. The purpose of the code of conduct is to ensure that everyone feels welcome and comfortable at our meetups. You can read the code of conduct in full on the website at the link that I've got on the screen there, but it boils down to 3 key points. So be respectful, be inclusive, and be aware. And this applies just as much to all our online communities at the moment, YouTube comments, Slack groups, all of that stuff, as much as it does when we're in person. If there's any concerns or if you'd like to speak with myself, Carl, or Nikki about anything related to the code of conduct, please just get in touch. Or you can do that anonymously via like a form on the CocoaHeads website if you like. Just any of the forms, even the submitted talk one, if you want to be like truly anonymous, you can do it through that. That's cool. And yeah, and the Slack community, just a reminder that that's a thing and you can join in the discussion. I'll also be using the Slack channel to post the link to the Zoom catch-up after this. So if you'd like to stick around and join the Zoom catch-up, the URL for that Zoom call will be going into Slack. So feel free to join and then stick around after if you'd like to chat about a few things. So when we meet in person, we usually do a big welcome to the first-time attendees and get them to stand up. Obviously, that's not possible right now, but if you're joining for the first time, especially if you're joining from somewhere that isn't Sydney, a big welcome. It's awesome to be able to have more people watching and listening during the pandemic. Obviously, there's lots of negatives to doing it this way, but one of the many positives is that many people from around the world get to watch. So a big welcome to everyone who's tuning in, and thank you, of course, for attending. So some events to keep an eye out for. Obviously, most events not really happening, but I highly recommend checking out the Melbourne CocoaHeads. It's an equally great meetup. They meet on the 2nd Thursday of the month instead of the 3rd like we do, and they're running completely online at the moment as well, and I believe they will be for the foreseeable future. So if you like tonight's meetup, if you like past meetups, definitely worth checking out the Melbourne CocoaHeads meetup as well, and they're hosted on Meetup, so you can get all the details there. Now, for the last few months, I believe I've said DevWorld, the conference, sort of the biggest iOS dev conference in Australia, they've promised something's coming during the pandemic, and they're going to do some kind of remote event, but we were pretty light on details until very recently. So the team behind DevWorld, the DevWorld conference, is the AUC, and they run a few conferences. DevWorld is the one focused on mobile app development, more specifically iOS. But they also run Create World and X World, which are conferences for other IT professionals as well. And so they're doing something really interesting this year where they're combining all 3 of these events, so DevWorld, Create World, and X World, into a single event, a 3-stream conference with a focus on all range of like IT topics. It's happening late November, from the 25th to the 27th. And if you're at all interested, if you've ever attended DevWorld and kind of still want to get a taste of that this year, or if this kind of thing just interests you generally, definitely worth checking out Every World. I imagine a few more details will be published closer to the event as they pick speakers and things like that. But I believe the call for participation is open now. So if you're interested or want to express interest in giving a talk, you can do that. It should be a good event that I'm looking forward to. And the other thing that the AUC is asking to highlight is they have a Discord channel. So the AUC typically targets Australia and New Zealand participants, and they've opened a sort of national level Discord channel. Everyone's welcome to join. And the link is on the website. So if you go to the AUC's website, or if you search for Every World, you should be able to find that and join the Discord channel and hang out and chat with fun, cool people. So it's well worth your time checking that out. All right, so on to tonight's schedule. Normally, again, when we meet in person, we do a thing called hiring and firing, where if you're either looking for work or if you have a role on offer, you can like stand up and mention it. The best way to do that at the moment, if you're looking for work or want to advertise a role, is to jump on our Slack group and post about it in the jobs channel. We've got plenty of people in that channel, plenty of people looking for work, and also plenty of people with opportunity for hiring opportunities. So definitely a good way to get the attention of potential candidates or of a new potential employer. Sorry. All right, so for tonight's schedule, we're going to kick off with a month in review by Nikki. Should be plenty to talk about after yesterday's Apple event. And following that, we'll have a talk by Sam Wright on data flow in Swift UI, which I'm very much looking forward to. And then that will conclude the formal meetup. But after that, we'll have a post-Zoom catch-up, and I'll be posting the link to that Zoom call at the conclusion of this YouTube live stream. So just jump on over to the Slack for that link once we're done with the talks for tonight. Before I go, October, we're still looking for talks. If you're interested in giving a talk, please jump over to the form on our website, fill it out. I'm happy for you to bounce ideas about talks around with me. I'll answer pretty much straight away if you have some questions or something. So you can get in touch with myself, Nikki, or Carl on Twitter or via that form on the website. And yeah, if you've got an idea for a talk or if you just want to run an idea past us, that would be cool. Also, if you're interested in giving the month in review, that would be great too. Feel free to get in touch. And as always, lightning talks are welcome. So even if you've got something to say, it's only going to take 5 minutes, that's great too. Feel free to submit it, and we'll put you in for October. So time to hand over to Nikki for the month in review. Thanks, Nikki. Take it away. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah. Awesome. Bear with me, guys, while I change the screen. There we go. All right. Welcome to CocoaHeads Months in Review. First up in our month of review is privacy. I'm sure we're already waiting and ready for the new privacy features and updated SDKs to be compatible with, for example, the new app tracking transparency framework. But just in case we're still solving that one little bug remaining, Apple has delayed providing information to the product page to the end of the year, as well as delayed the required asking for permission to track feature to early next year. Now that feature is probably going to hurt a lot of businesses that rely on ads. So seeing this delayed for a little while is nice, so we can implement it in nice ways to ask for permission, so that we get those permissions and can actually get some ad revenue. Next up are updates to the App Store review process. So as suggested in WWDC this year, as developers, we can now suggest changes to the review guidelines. And Apple is also starting to soften up a little bit, just at that, by paving the way for Microsoft xCloud and Google Stadia to make their cloud in-game apps available. Now, there's a little caveat there that every game has to be a separate app on the App Store. So I don't really know how that will play out, because they can have a store app, and then all their games need to be a separate app. So it's still not really cloud gaming as I'm considered. But let's see how that plays out. Speaking of games, over the course of a month, well, the past 2 months really, a lot has happened on the Epic Games versus Apple battle. Epic Games' developer account is now terminated, and Apple has also threatened to stop users signing in with Apple if they're already using Fortnite. So the sign in with Apple button would be disabled. Now, apparently this has been rolled back. So we can still use sign in with Apple when we're gaming on Fortnite. But the fight's definitely still ongoing. And although I don't play Fortnite myself, I'm sure this is hurting gamers all over the world that are using their mobile device to play games. My personal thoughts on this, though, is that a 30% cut for the App Store is similar for consoles and the likes, the PlayStation and Sony and Nintendo, etc. They take a similar cut for hosting games on their platforms, and it's not really a problem there. So I don't see the real problem. We're getting an App Store, we're getting all these free marketing, etc. from that. So I believe it's not bad. On some brighter news, Apple has now increased the capabilities of sandbox testing as well, with new updates that allow us to test upgrades, downgrades, and cancellations. Whilst I haven't used that in-app purchase for a while now, I'm pretty sure these are well appreciated by the community as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there and say that they look awesome. I haven't had the chance to use them yet, but having done a bit of in-app purchase and subscription stuff recently, I'm looking forward to testing with these new features.
Sweet, looking forward to what you'll make with them. All right, next up is news, fun stuff. If you missed it yesterday, Apple announced the new Apple Watch Series 6 with a blood oxygen meter, which calculates your blood oxygen level. And it also has a U1 chip that enables improved spatial awareness. This is the same chips that was seen in the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro from last year. And apparently they will be used in the upcoming AirTags, as well as, well, to easily find lost items, but who knows when that will be released. And apparently there's going to be more features for it as well. I have no idea what they mean by it, but let's see what happens there. The second watch to be announced is the Apple Watch SE. Feature-wise, it looks to sit a bit between the Series 5 and the Series 4 from 2 years ago, minus the ECG meter, which we don't really have access to in Australia anyway, and minus the always-on display. And speed-wise, it looks to be similar to the Series 5 because it shares the same CPU as that model. I'm currently still perfectly happy with my Series 4, so I predict this is a really good buy for everyone on the fence for an Apple Watch. So yeah, I see this as a good model. With new watches, of course, there's new bands. My interest take from these are the solo loop or the braided solo loop in particular. They are slightly elastic bands and snug fit right around your wrist. Available in 9 sizes. So if you do want one of these, I suggest checking them out in store, breaking the COVID rules. And there's also some other updates on other bands like the Leather Link, for example. So yeah, check out apple.com if you want more info on watch bands. So along with new watches comes a new piece of software as well called Family Setup. This is a piece of software that enables you as a parent to set up watches for your kids or your grandparents without the need to get them an iPhone. And it also includes a school time mode, which puts the watch in a non-disturb mode with limited interaction and a special watch face. Now, this is probably a cool idea if you want to give your kids an Apple Watch to go to school. I'm not actually sure how many parents give their kids an Apple Watch, but there we go. Second big hardware release for this year is, for this yesterday, is an update to the mainstream iPad model. It's the cheapest new iPad you can buy if you don't really necessarily need the Apple Pencil 2 and a large screen estate. And also obviously the new Pro keyboards with the mouse. I don't believe these are working with it. I know the Air does, but so yeah, if you're on the fence for a cheap iPad model, this one's definitely the one to buy. And then following is an update to the iPad Air with a new A14 Bionic CPU that will probably be in the new iPhones as well. It kind of puts it ahead of this year's iPad Pro in performance, which is kind of funny. So if you're out to get a new iPad, you want a bit of power and you don't necessarily need a LiDAR scanner, I really don't see the advantage of getting an iPad Pro over these ones because these ones work with the Apple Pencil 2 and also with the smart keyboards. So yeah, it's a pretty solid move. Enough on hardware for now. So Apple released a new fitness app that's probably fun for a lot of us. I'm actually sure. I'm just going to the gym. But Apple has announced to combine services, to combine the subscriptions in this new service called Apple One. And it's really solid value for what you get if you are using Music and Apple TV Plus already, and perhaps News Plus. Combining all these in a single cost a month and saving a bit of money is yeah, probably a good idea. You can also share these with 5 other people in your family, so that's yeah, that's definitely good value. I think this might be able to hurt some of the other subscription services out there. We'll see what happens. And then what surprised everyone the most, I guess, was the sudden release of iOS 14, with just 1 day of using Xcode 12 GM before the release hit the customer. So what this tells us is a release can always happen. We should always be prepared for something like this and use the betas as soon as they come out to start testing our apps and paving our way for adapting iOS 14 features, making sure that it works on an iOS 14 device, so that as soon as the GM is out, we can submit to the App Store and we're all ready. Now, there's obviously some caveats there. There are apps that we depend on sometimes, and we can't test those until they have an iOS 14 version. So yeah, it's definitely very sudden, and it was a big surprise for everyone in the community. And last but not least, talking a bit about stocks. I always end with this one. So if you were buying stocks last time I spoke, I think this was about May this year somewhere. They have now dropped in price. No, that's just kidding. They have actually risen by a lot. This is they split into, so one stock became four stocks. So if you compare between back in May and now, they have risen a lot. So if you bought then, you would have earned a lot of money. I still didn't, but I'm still looking at them every time to make sure how much money I lost by not investing. All right, and with that said, I'm giving it over to, oh, where's my, can you still see the screen? Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Cool.
Thanks so much. Sam, please take it over.
Sam, you're muted. No, still muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah,
better,
perfect.
Okay,
cool. Thanks, Sam.
Cool. Hang on, I've just hit this Mac problem where I need to allow Zoom access. So give me 1 second. I definitely should have worked this out before.
Oh,
1 sec.
Yeah, Nikki, you touched on it at the end there, but it's really interesting to see all the devs complain on Twitter about that short turnaround time for iOS 14.
Yeah,
it seems like there's a few
100%.
people in a bit of a predicament at the moment. That's all right. It is what it is. But yeah, a bit of a shock when you're used to kind of years of having at least a week's heads up before that GM.
Yeah, I guess it is what it is.
Yeah.
It happened, and we just have to be ready. It could happen again.
We got some time to fill. Did you order a watch on it?
I did not.
Cool. All right, Sam's back on the call.
So that was interesting. I've had that twice today. It was actually ticked the box, but apparently not. I had to untick it and tick it again. Anyway, let's check on. Cool. You can all hear me?
Yep.
Yes, perfect.
I hope. Awesome. Cool. So today,
Sorry, are you meant to
I'm going to be
sharing
talking
your
about.
screen?
Yeah, I'll switch to that.
Oh, okay. I'm just checking. Sorry.
Can you see it? Got
Yeah,
the screen?
perfect. Cool. Sorry, just checking.
Cool. No, all good. So today I'm looking at data flow in SwiftUI. So just a little bit about me before we start. Currently a developer working at Telstra Purple. I'm in Melbourne, so I haven't left my house in 6 months. And we've been working on this app kind of at work using SwiftUI, SwiftUI 2. And I just thought I should talk a little bit about how we do data flow, because I find that's one of the first things that kind of we get a little bit stuck on and find a bit challenging. So before I start talking about SwiftUI, I just want to talk about why SwiftUI is the way to develop new apps. Firstly, UI kit is definitely still more fully featured, but I expect more and more of Apple's development efforts will go towards SwiftUI. And I guess another benefit is apps can run on Mac, iPhone, iPad, Apple Watch, Apple TV with exactly the same code, and it provides the abstractions for like navigation or whatever that component happens to be doing. And I reckon, if you're starting a new app in 2020 or, you're learning iOS development for the first time, SwiftUI is definitely the way to go forward with that. So let's go through an overview of what I'll be talking about today. So firstly, what do we currently do? So what's the UI kit way of doing things? And then what's the SwiftUI way is what I'm going to go into after that. And finally, I'm going to speak a little bit about source of truth. So what do we currently do? So I'm just going to give you a look at an idea of what I think the reminders app code might look like. And don't worry too much about, exactly what this is doing. But we all know the reminders app, you can, select and unselect a mark a reminder is completed, unmark it, you can delete reminders, you can add a new reminder. This is kind of what that would look like. So we've got the reminders list view controller. Basically, we get the data and we make enough rows to hold each bit of each reminder, for example. And then we loop through each row and, we say, what do we want in row 0? What do we want in row 1? What do we want in row 2? So you can see it's pretty verbose. So there's got to be a better way. Enter SwiftUI. Now, this is a video, but I don't think the sound's working. So anyway, it's this guy, Luca from Apple, talking about data flow through Swift. Essentially what he's saying is SwiftUI views are declarative and they're all dependent on the data. So you should never have to manually synchronize two pieces of data within your app or have to invalidate a view when the data changes. So with SwiftUI, you simply just describe everything declaratively, and then that means that you can focus on building the best experience for your user. So let's have a look what I mean by data-driven. So what I mean is, firstly, the UI is derived from data. Second, events update that data. So let's have a look at the SwiftUI code here. So this is the same reminders app, and this is how, this is kind of a version of how you could do it in SwiftUI. So I'll go into a better code example in a sec, but basically this is the view. We've got a list of reminders, got our body, which is what is actually rendered onto the screen. Then we've got a list with our reminders in it. So that just loops through each reminder from our data source, hence data-driven. And then we just show basically a tick and the name of the reminder. You contrast that to what the UI kit way is, and you can kind of see, even just looking at the amount of code there, the benefits of using SwiftUI. So let's use an example app. And here in Victoria, we've got this government organization called the EPA, or Environmental Protection Authority, or something like that. And they have this API which shows a number of different air quality parameters from a number of different sites. So as you can see here, we've got all the different monitoring sites, and you can basically go in, you can select a monitoring site, and it tells you like what the readings are, like what the carbon dioxide levels or the NO2 levels. So I basically brought in this API, let the user select a monitoring site, and then for each bit of data, they can open and see a little bit more about what that statistic actually means. So I just created this app just basically to demonstrate some of the concepts that I want to talk about in this talk today. So as you can see, that's what it is. So the first thing that we get to is, the first screen that we get to when we open the app is this list where you can select a monitoring site. So the UI presents this list in the first place because there's no monitoring site currently selected or currently select. So what we do is we select a monitoring site, and what this does is saves it in our state. So now that we actually have a monitoring site saved in our state, the UI responds to the data that's in that state and goes out of that list view and into our data view. So there's that first list view. And then once you tap on Geelong South, now that we've got a site actually populated, we can see we've got the data. If this still doesn't make sense to you, that's okay, because I'll go into the code. Show us the code. So here's that list that I was talking about just before. And we've got a whole bunch of buttons here on the right. So firstly, let's go ahead and mark our state. I'm introducing this new property wrapper here. It's called @state. I'll go into a little bit more about what this means in a second, but just know that that's what we need to use. And we've marked that around a variable called selected site ID. What selected site ID is a type string, and it's an optional type, meaning it can be blank or nil, or it can actually have a value. And we'll use that in a sec. So then we've got a Z stack. So if you've used SwiftUI before, you'll know about H stacks, which are horizontal stacks. So every item in your H stack is arranged next to each other. We've got V stacks, which are vertical, and then we've got Z stacks, which are views on top of each other. So you can kind of arrange in the 3D in the Z dimension, the Z axis. So I've created this Z stack, and I've got two different views or two different paths. So my first path is if selected site ID actually has a value, we go through the first path and show our selected site ID view. Otherwise, if we haven't yet set our selected site ID, we want to show a different view. And the different view that we want to show, because we don't yet have a selected site ID, because this is the first time that we've opened the app, we're going to be showing this view. So let's dive into that code. And so we can see here, we've got a V stack and it's got some text at the top, select your nearest monitoring site. We've got up here, select your nearest monitoring site. And then we've got a list of EPA data and each of the sites. And each of the sites is a button. And when you tap on that button, we're simply saving our state. So you can see here, when we tap on this list row, that sets our selected site ID to be whatever the site ID of whatever item we've tapped in this list. So you can see I've tapped on it, and now let's save our state, which is 12AA6. So I've gone ahead and done that, and now that I've updated my state, that will cause this body variable here to re-render. And what I mean by re-render is it will basically run this again. So you'll notice the first time that I did it, we didn't have a selected site ID set. So I picked the code that was in else branch. So that was this list here. But now that we actually do have a selected site ID, we hit the first condition of our branch here and we display this selected site view. And as you can see, we're now displaying our selected site view. Cool. So what is state? State's a property, and this is how Apple defines it in their docs, a property wrapper type that can be read or that can read or write a value managed by SwiftUI. So when do we use state? We use it for keeping track of simple value types like string, integer, or bool. We also use it when the view creates and owns that data. But what if the view is not the owner? And what do I mean by this? So let's have a look at this. And here, this is actually in the app once we have a selected site ID. I've got this little icon, this triangle in the top right, where you can change the location. You can change which selected monitoring site that you're looking at. So you can see I'm selecting a whole bunch of different ones here. And what we're doing is updating that selected site ID. So this is what we were looking at before, our content view, the same view we were looking at before, but this time we've gone into that path where we've selected this site ID. So we're showing the site and we're showing all the data. But I want to abstract away or refactor out our header view into a different view. You probably want to start doing this if you're reusing views across your app. So you don't want to write the same code a whole bunch of times. But in my case, I'm really just refactoring this out so I don't have one file with 400 lines with my whole application. So I've created my header view. My header view contains this Geelong South, or the title of the monitoring site, the date, and this icon here. When you tap on that icon, you get that menu. That's all part of the header view. So how do we actually get our selected site ID into that menu? And then how do we update our selected site ID from our header view? So this is what our header view looks like. And I've just extracted just showing you the menu part, which is what happens when you tap on that little triangle. So it basically generates a menu, and then for every item in the menu, so for every EPA data.sites, it is creating a button. And when you tap on the button, it sets our selected site ID to be the site ID of whatever we tapped. So here's our two views side by side. We've got our content view and we've got our header view. And just a little bit of a side note on relationships. So in this case, our content view is the parent view and header view is our child view, because the header view is within the content view. So what I want to explain is how we can actually set our selected site ID, which here in the content view, this is where we've created our selected site ID variable. We've marked it as state, but our header view has no idea that exists. This selected site ID is not part of header view here. So how can we get it in there? There's a couple of different options. So option one, we could just pass it in as a regular variable. So we're instantiating our header view here. So we're creating a header view and we're passing in an argument called selected site ID. And this selected site ID, we're just passing in this variable that we've created here, this selected site ID. Then in our header view, we're taking in that selected site ID just as a regular variable of exactly the same type, of course. And what's going to happen here is this will work for reading the data, but not for writing it. So by reading, I mean, if you might have noticed in that menu, when you open it, when I tapped on an item, it had a tick next to the item that I picked. So that's actually reading the selected site ID to know which item to put that tick next to. But when you actually tap on one of those buttons and we're setting the selected site ID to be the site ID of whatever we tapped, that's going to update this variable here, but it's not going to update our content view at all. And note before when I talked about state, this body variable changes or re-renders every time this state variable is updated. So if we're only updating this selected site ID in header view and not the selected site ID in content view, our body variable here is never going to re-render and we're never going to see the new data on the right. What we'll see is that tick will move to a different item in that menu, but that's it. We're not going to get this view to re-render. And fortunately, Xcode will actually pick up on this and it'll let us know when we try and modify a variable like this, it'll actually say this is not valid. So that's a big fat X. So option 2, we can mark them both as state. So you can see we use state the first time, our state property wrapper. Let's use it again in header view. That seems right? Well, not really. So state, like I said before, when I explained what state was, state is the owner of the value. And in this case, content view is the owner of that value. Header view is not the owner. It just wants to read and write to that value. So this is also the wrong thing. This also will work, but the same problem as before, or at least we won't get an error in Xcode, but we're going to have the same problem as before in that when we update our state, we're not going to get anything changing in this content view here because we haven't updated the state from content view. We're only updating the state within header view. They're not linked to each other. So that's another big fat cross. So option 3, I'm introducing a new property wrapper here. It's called @binding. What @binding is a way to read and write to a variable that's been marked with state, but not actually own the variable. We're just consuming it. So we're just reading and writing it to it. We're not creating it. So what we do here, we've created our state in our content view, selected site ID. We're passing our selected site ID into the header view when we instantiate the header view, but this time we're putting a little $sign before selected site ID. And what this $sign does is gives us the bound version of that variable. So it's kind of a little handy feature that this @state property wrapper gives us. And it lets us read and write to a value without owning the value. So we put that $sign in. If you forget that, your Xcode will complain. So you probably won't forget it. And then in header view here, we just need to mark the variable that we want to read and write to with @binding. And this will all work as expected. So when we update our selected site ID with the new monitoring site that we select from that menu, that will then update our content view. Our selected site ID state will change, and that will cause our body to re-render, which will then show us the data of the site that we've just selected. So that's a good option. So what's a binding? It's a property wrapper type that can read and write a value, but owned by a source of truth or owned by another view. In this case, I'll actually go through what source of truth is a little bit later on. But that's the definition if you go on the docs. So we use a binding for keeping track of simple value types like a string, int, or bool, same as state. But in this case, a different view creates and owns the data. So content view created and owned it, and header view is just consuming it, so read and writing it. We don't use binding when the type's a complex object, which I'll go into in 1 minute. And we also don't use it when the view's the owner of the data. So if it's the owner, you need to use state. If it's just using it, it needs to use binding. So what about complex objects? So at the moment, all I've talked about is just a simple string, but I've got this other object called EPA data. And EPA data is a class that I've created, and I'll show you it in a sec. But we use EPA data here, and I've assigned it to the variable EPA data to populate our list of sites. So you might have noticed earlier when I was explaining how the list is populated, I take in this EPA data.sites list, and then that basically just loops through and for each site makes one of these rows. I've also got this onAppear part here. So onAppear is a view modifier that you can add to any view in SwiftUI. And when that view is first drawn on the screen, it runs this onAppear callback, and it'll basically run any code. So this is like this is one of the events that you can run some code on. There's other ones like on disappear or on change or on tap and some other ones. Anyway, on appear, what that does is calls our EPA data object, so self.epa data, and it calls a method called load sites list. What this is doing is just hitting the API and bringing back the sites list and putting it into our sites variable here. So I'll show you the actual EPA data object. So this is what I was just talking about before. So I was showing you how we used it. This is the actual object. So it's a complex object. It's class EPA data. It's got a variable or a property with our list of sites. So that's just an array of sites. And you can see our site struct down here. So each site just has a site ID and a site name, both strings. And then we've got a function here called load sites list. And that calls the API, brings back the data, and puts all the sites that it got into this self.sites property, which is this sites property. So once we call load sites list, that will populate our empty array here, fill in all the sites and let us use it in our list. So this is what I've done so far. I've got our class with our sites list. Our sites list is blank. I'm showing our sites list through the list, and I've called this load sites list method, but still we have no data on the right. So what exactly am I missing here? There's a couple of things we need to do to actually let this body variable know that site now has a value in it. So let's go back to our EPA data object, and you'll notice I've added two small changes. The first one was this observable object. So now EPA data conforms to observable object, which means it's kind of like it's a type of observable object. So EPA data now when the view uses, so our content view uses EPA data, it knows that this is an object or this is a class that we need to keep track of. The other thing we need to do is mark any properties that we actually want to keep track of with this @publish property wrapper. This is the third property wrapper that I've introduced in this talk. What this does is any property that you mark with the @publish property wrapper, and the property needs to be within an observable object. Any view that uses that observable object will re-render its body variable when anything in this publish property changes. And so finally here we've got our load sites list. We call load sites list. We save our sites variable with whatever data comes back. And now because this is @publish, that lets the view know that now we don't have an empty array anymore. We've now got our list of sites. So we go back to this and we notice we still don't have any sites on the right. So what else do I need to do? Well, we need to do one last thing. And this is the fourth property wrapper I'm going to introduce, which is called @state object. @state object is kind of similar to state, except it's not used for simple types like string or int. It's used for complex data types like this class that I've created. State object can only work on classes that are of type observable object. So this works because EPA data conforms to observable object. And now that I've added this, what happens is when this view is created, it creates a version or an instance of EPA data. And for the lifetime of this view, that EPA data object will exist. It will keep track of managing that for you. And now that I've added that, we can see our list is here, and yeah, it's all working, which is great. So state object, that's what I introduced. It's a property wrapper type that instantiates an observable object. So you use it when you want to create a new observable object. When do we use state object? We use it when we want to keep track of properties within a complex class type. We want to use it when the view is instantiating the object and it owns the data. So when don't we use state object? Well, we don't use it when the data we want to keep track of is simple type, like string, int, or bool. We just use regular state for that. And we also use it when we don't use it when the view isn't the owner of the data. So that leads us to our kind of fourth or fifth, or I've introduced a few property wrappers. This is the fourth main one. What if the view is not the owner? So kind of like how binding is not the owner, where state is the owner. We've got state object. And what do we do when we've got a view that wants to use something that's a state object, but doesn't actually instantiate or own that? So let's have a look. So we've got our header view, back to our header view. And you can see this is everything that we did before. We've got this for each here, and the for each loops through the EPA data.sites. But you'll notice in our header view, we actually don't have access to the EPA data class. So we created that in content view, but header view has no idea that we created that and doesn't have access to it. So how can we give header view access to our EPA data state object? So let's have a look. So we've got our content view at the top here with the state that we created earlier and the state object, this APA data class. In header view, we want access to the APA data class, but we don't at the moment. So what can we do? Well, we need to add two different things. The first one is in our header view, when we instantiate it, we need to pass in our APA data class as another property. And then in our header view itself, we need to set up an observed object, which is the next property wrapper we're going to look at. And what observed object does is it is kind of what binding is to state, except it's for state object. So it's when we want to keep track of an observed object, we want to know when it changes to re-render the view, but we don't actually want to own it. We just want to look at someone, a class an observable object that someone else owns. So our APA data class is an observable object. So that means here when we're using state object, we're creating that observable object. And anytime something in that observable object changes, this body variable re-renders. So we pass that APA data class into a header view. A header view takes in that observed object, and anytime that APA data class changes, this body variable will also re-render in addition to the content view. The other cool thing is when you update something within, you can actually update properties within APA data as well, although I'm not showing that here. But anyway, basically that passes in our APA data sites as an observed object. And now we can access our APA data.sites property. And anytime that changes, so, when we first load that data and it goes from blank to being a populated list of sites, that will also affect our header view. So observed object, it's a property wrapper type that subscribes to an observable object and invalidates a view whenever the observable object changes. So invalidate meaning every time it changes, it re-renders the view. We use an observed object when we're keeping track of complex types with properties, but we use it when a different view creates and owns the data. So the view that uses observed object isn't the owner or the creator, it simply subscribes to a different, a state object that a different view is created. So we don't use observed object when the type's a simple data type or when the view is the owner of the data. Here I tried to create the one more thing slide, but I couldn't get the exact colors, but one more thing, environment object. So far we've only looked at these basic parent-child relationships. So we've had our content view, that's the owner of the data, and header view is just a refactoring of the top part of that view. And then for state, I'm passing selected site ID through from our content view to our header view as a binding. And then for our state object, I pass our APA data observable object as an observed object through to APA data in our header view. But your app is likely to look a little bit more complex than just the two views. In fact, it'll probably look something like this. You've got your content view at the top, but you've got a whole bunch of different views and you only need your APA data. Let's say you create the APA data object in your content view, but you need access to that way down, 4 or 5 views deep, but you don't need all the other views in between having access to this data because they don't need to do anything with that list of, those air quality parameters, that monitoring sites list. So what do? We don't want to have to pass through this APA data as an observable or as an observed object through every one of these views because they don't need to know about it and they don't do anything with that data. So introducing environment objects. So what environment object does is you add it as a view modifier, so .environment object on a view underneath that view, and you pass in your state object. And I'll go through a code example in a second, just to make it a little bit more clear. But you pass it through, and then any view underneath it, any child view or any ancestor view, has access to that APA data object via this @environment object property wrapper. And so you can just use this in a view, and if the object is in the environment anywhere, it'll let you use it. So let's have a look at how we do that. We've got our content view. Once again, because APA data is the owner of that data, because content view is the owner of the APA data object, we just instantiate it here as a state object. But then we pass on the next view below content view, we add a view modifier called environment object, and we pass in our state object. So in this case, APA data. And then what we do is in our sub view or somewhere way down, we can use this property wrapper called @environment object. And that looks for any objects in the environment of the type APA data and lets us use it. There's a few caveats to this. If you accidentally forget to, attach the environment object to a view anywhere or a view that's like a parent or some ancestor of the sub view, you'll find that this will crash. And this doesn't crash on compile time, but it actually crashes on runtime. So you really need to make sure that you've done this environment object part and you're very sure that that environment object is there. The other thing to note is when we use this environment object property wrapper, it looks for an environment object of the type EPA data in the environment somewhere. So this means that you can't have two objects of the same type in your environment because it only looks for one. It just looks for that type. So if you've got two objects that are both EPA data, it's not going to know which one to pick. Anyway, now that we have EPA data, we're able to use our sites. In this case, I'm just displaying a site name, but we have access to that full object. So before I finish, I just want to talk a little bit about ownership and which views should be instantiating your data and which views own the data. So what is the source of truth? By source of truth, I mean only ever store a piece of data in one single place. So by that, I mean never try and keep two pieces of data in sync. The UI is just completely computed based on your data. So your data drives what the UI looks like. And given the same data, the UI will always look the same. So it's kind of like functional programming in that you give it, it's like a pure function. You give it one input and it always outputs the same thing. So where do we define our source of truth? Who owns the data? Well, the first point to note is store all significant data in observable objects. By significant data, I mean like business logic. So not state, like, a toggle on and off, or if a view is open or closed, but actually our business logic. So in my case, that would be the monitoring sites or the air quality parameters. You should only use state for simple UI state. So like I said, toggles on and off, if a view is open or closed, that kind of thing. This is actually what it says in the documentation if you have a look at where you should use state. And you should instantiate the source of truth in the lowest common ancestor. And I'll show you a diagram of that in 1 second. But what I mean by that is basically the lowest common view, or the lowest view where all the views that need access to it share. So here, for example, I'm going to go through two different examples. The first one is this user details state object. User details contains just some simple things like maybe the user's email address or their name. And so we instantiate that in our content view. We attach it to our environment, and then these two views, so the one over on the left here and the one over on the right here, both have access to the user details. So if this was like a shopping cart app, maybe this view over here is like when you check out and needs to know your email address to send you a receipt. But over here might be a subscribe to our email newsletter. So that's like a completely different component that needs access to the same data. And this is where you'd use environment object. And we'd instantiate it way at the top because this is kind of the least highest ancestor of the two. And to note, this environment object actually attaches to this view down here. So maybe I should update that slide. But what if we have, we also want to put our EPA, show our EPA data in this app, but we don't need the whole app to know about our EPA data. So we do need the whole app to know about what the user's email address is, but we don't need the whole app to know about the air quality monitoring sites. We only need certain views to know about that. So in this case, we'd use state object and we'd instantiate it way down in that view. So only this view, which owns the data, and then this view underneath it, which uses that, reads and writes to that data, need to know about that data. We wouldn't instantiate EPA data way at content view here because the rest of the app and the views don't need to know about that data. So in summary, we've looked at a couple of different property wrappers, or the 5 on the left there. And I'm just going to go through what they're all used for. So state, as we looked at, is just used for simple data types like int or bool or string. And state is used when the view owns that data. And because the view owns that data, we don't need to pass it in when we instantiate the view that uses that. For a binding, that's also used for simple data types. So once again, int, bool, string. But that is when the view doesn't own the data. So what we need to do is pass it through in the view initializer. Our state object, this is used for complex data types. So similar to state, it also owns the data, but this is for keeping track of classes that we've created, and they need to conform to observable object. We've also got observed object, which is used to consume state objects, so read and write to state object in views that don't own the data, and we pass that through via the view initializer. So when we instantiate a view that has access to an object that was created in a different view, we need to pass that through the view initializer when we instantiate it to use it as an observed object. Environment object, on the other hand, is exactly the same as observed object, except we don't need to pass it through the view initializer. So when we create that child view, we don't need to pass it through, when we create header view, we don't need to put in those brackets. We just mark it, we attach it to the environment via that view modifier, and we're able to access it using this property wrapper environment object. So in summary, we touched upon how SwiftUI is declarative, not imperative. We learned about how state, binding, state object, observed object, and environment object all work and when to use them. And finally, we looked at where to define our source of truth. So that is pretty much it. Follow me on Twitter. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm more than happy to answer if I know the answer. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Back to you, Zach.
Cool. Thanks heaps for that, Sam. That was great. I think that talk is a really excellent resource for everyone who's using SwiftUI. So thanks for that. Kind of wish would have been great to see a year ago and get familiar with it then. But no, that was really in depth. And just like that blog post you did as well. So thanks for that. All right. So that brings us to the end of the meetup. Thanks heaps to Sam for that talk, and thanks to Nikki for doing the month in review. We're going to jump on a Zoom call shortly after this. If anyone feels like joining, I'll be posting the link in Slack. I imagine there'll be a bunch of chatter about the Apple event yesterday and such other topics. So feel free to join. Otherwise, we'll catch you all next month. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Bye.